English 111 Final Exam, Spring 2020. Reading number 2. For Saundra, by Nikki Giovanni. When you want to read and cite this poem, you have to remember that it's written in lines and stanzas. The line numbers appear on the left-hand side of the page. When you quote from the poem, include the author's last name and the line number in your citation, and you can see the example given below. When you quote poetry, it's important to indicate line breaks through using a slash mark, also known as a virgule, also as in the example above. Nikki Giovanni's involvement in the Black Arts movement provides an important backdrop for her poem, even though the poem doesn't focus on race. The Black Arts movement was founded by American poet Amiri Baraka in the mid-1960s to create new cultural institutions focused on the black experience and opposed to traditional Western influences. The Black Arts movement had roots in 1960s revolutionary countercultural movements such as the Nation of Islam, the Black Power movement, and the Civil Rights movement. Giovanni was a key figure in the Black Arts movement. For Saundra was written in 1968 and reflects many concerns of its era. For example, the poem mentions President-elect Richard Nixon in line 21, who Giovanni derisively calls "no dick." And the poem ends wondering, quote, "Perhaps these are not poetic times at all." In 1968, the United States was in the middle of political and cultural upheaval. The Vietnam War had been waged for years and was increasingly controversial and unpopular. The Civil Rights Movement was shaking the legal and cultural foundations of American racial segregation. Second wave feminism was shaking the legal and cultural foundations of gender inequality. In its focus on revolution, a concern of the Black Arts movement, For Saundra captures this sense that great social change was in the air. In addition to reflecting concerns about its historical era, For Saundra is also a poem about poetry. The poem begins and ends by mentioning poetry, questioning whether poetry as an art form is adequate or appropriate to the historical circumstances. The neighbor who appears in stanza 2 asks if Giovanni, quote, ever writes tree poems. Tree poems represents the neighbor's conventional idea of poetry, simple poems about nature's beauty. Giovanni tries to write a beautiful green tree poem, but peeks out her window and is confronted by the urban reality of asphalt, no green, no trees. After failing to write about trees, Giovanni tries to write a big blue sky poem in stanza 3. However, she feels that the clouds have all winged low since Richard Nixon was elected. Another instance in the poem where nature fails to offer consolation for historical circumstances. This leads Giovanni to wonder in stanza 4 if, quote, maybe I shouldn't write at all, but clean my gun and check my kerosene supply. These are two activities that could potentially prepare her for social upheaval. From the start of the poem, Giovanni questions the utility of poetry for social change. She wants to, quote, write a poem that rhymes, but revolution doesn't lend itself to bee-bopping. Her neighbor's view of poetry leans traditional, pastoral poems that celebrate nature's beauty. Giovanni's own view of poetry is more complex. Numerous passages in the poem express doubt about poetry's practical value in times of great change. Yet she is expressing those doubts in the form of a poem. Giovanni's doubts about poetry particularly traditional nature poetry are related to her concern with the revolutionary potential of that historical moment. The diction in For Saundra provides further clues about Giovanni's attitude toward poetry. The poem has a casual tone, lots of plain, ordinary words rather than heightened poetic language. Her decision to write the pronoun I as a lowercase letter rather than as a capital letter reinforces this sense of casualness. The poem is not written with rhyme or traditional meter. Its stanzas and lines tend to be brief, almost clipped, and the line breaks occur at variable places each line. Giovanni ends For Saundra on a note of uncertainty. Quote, "Perhaps these are not poetic times at all." The word perhaps leaves open space for doubt and interpretation. The late 1960s could still be poetic times despite Giovanni's misgivings. Her inclusion of the qualifier maybe in stanza 4, maybe I shouldn't write, leaves open similar interpretive space. A good interpretation of the poem should take these ambiguities into account and use textual evidence to support its claims.